as economic collapses happen, war is a solution for world leaders. They will abscond and they will obfuscate and they will hide and they will shelter themselves, or they'll think that they will, in a cloud of economic craziness by making the story shift to war. Welcome everyone to this podcast, Crashes and Taxes. I am your podcast host, Rebecca Walser. I am coming to you from my New York location. So I want to discuss with you today what is happening in the world and really some really hard truths about what happens in times of economic changeover and economic rise and falls, because that's really where we are. I just think that everyone needs to understand. So I want to talk to you about a couple of quotes, and then we're going to get into kind of all of the data. So Ray Dalio, billionaire Ray Dalio, basically is recently quoted as saying, "We are close to a brutal World War III." CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, it was like 3 C's and a D, wasn't going to work. CEO JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon says, the attacks on Israel may have far-reaching impacts. This may be the most dangerous time the world has seen in decades. And then you have a congressionally appointed bipartisan panel called the Strategic Posture Commission, which they have just released a report titled, "The United States Must Prepare for Possible Simultaneous Wars with Russia and China." This report calls for an immediate expansion of conventional forces as well as enhancing our nuclear weapons program. So the situation that we have happening globally in 2024 is an economic shift. We have left unipolarity, and it has taken a while, but it is going to begin and happen in earnest in 2024. Like, it is going to actually, you're going to see the parting of time, and you're going to see us move from one situation to another. Now, this has happened both economically and it's happening geopolitically. So from an economic perspective, or I have said to you all, and I've shared with you multiple times, remember, what happens in Asia will also then move to Europe. It kind of moves towards the West. So it goes from Asia to Europe to America. The reason it comes to America last, just so that you can understand, is because right now we are the global reserve currency. So what happens is we have sort of the last man standing kind of situation where we're allowed to benefit economically all the time by the fact that the rest of the world has historically bought US dollars to buy their crude oil from the OPEC and plus, including Russia, nations. And that was kind of a block that controlled, okay, the dollars always had to be used. And then, you know, the dollar is the denominated currency on the SWIFT system, which is the international payment processing system of the West. Now, it all merges together. What we're getting now is a convergence of all things. And specifically, what I'm talking about is the economic results of us stimulating globally so much from 2020 and how that is tapered through our system, how Russia invaded Ukraine. And I would highly encourage you to go out and watch the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin, not because I agree with anything Putin says or doesn't say. I don't know. This is not my area of expertise. But I think if we are going to be asked as taxpayers in the United States of America to contribute tax dollars to helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia's encroachment into their borders, that we should understand what Russia's viewpoint is on this situation. We are basically fighting a proxy war against Russia via Ukraine by funding Ukraine. Ukraine could not have held up this long without the United States funding. That's why this administration is so desperate to get additional funding to this country. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in March of 2020, February, March of 2022, the West, and I've told you what the West is many, many times, but again, I'll mention it, the United States, Canada, Europe, the UK, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So it's Europe, the UK, and when I mean the EU and the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Canada. The G7, think of it in terms of that outside of China and Russia. Just think of it in terms of the West has been the dollar denominated system and the reserve for the world. And when Russia invaded Ukraine and the United States decided to weaponize the dollar by saying, no, Russia, we're going to sanction you by not allowing you to conduct transactions in the US dollar. As Putin interviewed with Tucker Carlson stated that Russia was not looking to de-dollarize. Russia was not looking to get out of US dollar transactions, and 80-something% of their transactions, foreign transactions, had occurred in US dollars. Now, post this getting kicked out of SWIFT, they have quickly leveraged their already formed BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now being joined by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. And what you see is that the terms of the agreements globally have changed. And Russia, along with China, is now conducting a lot of their international trade in Chinese yuan and obviously Russian rubles. But there's a lot of bilateral payment settlements that are happening between massive countries of massive populations that are not having anything to do for the first time with US dollars. So we are moving away from the unipolar world of the US dollar alone. The unipolar world of solely the US dollar has actually already ended. And we are now in a multipolar situation, West versus East. Now, most of the newer countries of, and when I say newer, I don't mean newer in time, but most of the countries that are not already officially tied to the West, which again, there's not that many of us, they are moving towards the East. And you're really seeing a pull away. Now, we have officially, I need to confirm it, but we have a really early report that is basically stating that Nigeria is beginning to state that they are going to sell their oil out in their local currency and outside of the US dollar. And that will be huge because that has not happened really since the petrodollar agreement was formed in the early 70s. Like this is very big. So let's get into the slides because I think you need to understand that we have this convergence of economics and geopolitics. And a lot of people think, well, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't, what are you talking about? Just, Rebecca, stick to your lane. I'm telling you, I have never before, of course, I haven't lived through a time of global war before because I'm not too young, but I have never before in my career seen such a convergence. It's the convergence of all global things. And what is converging specifically is because the world is economically melting down. This is going to be a meltdown to true intrinsic hard asset values again. So we have gotten completely away from true intrinsic hard asset values through the use of derivatives. Our derivatives are the problem. They were the problem in 2008. They're 13x the problem in 2024. So like literally we can't even go there for that comparison. But the bottom line is we are going to melt back down to real hard asset values or some very close relationship to them. And we are going to lose a lot of economic value, and there's going to be a lot of economic pain that comes from this. And as a result, war is inevitable because war always follows massive economic transition. Now, sometimes it seems to come first, but what you find out years later, if you're a student of history, is in fact that the economy was literally on its last legs and the government was aware and therefore kind of brought forward these geopolitical distractions globally, because no one cares about the economy if the country is at war. So let's go ahead and look at some of our slides, and I will definitely come back to this point of war. The first thing I want to talk about is what's happening globally. And the very first thing I'll mention is, I want to talk, I don't have a slide on this, but I want to talk about the Chinese stock market. We know the real estate sector in China has collapsed. I remember, I think I've shared with you that I was in London at one of my classes for my MBA with the London School of Economics, and we were literally discussing the fact that a news report had come out that day that Evergrande was going to miss a bond interest payment. And so I just want you to understand that was literally almost 4 years ago, not quite, about 3.5 years ago. And Evergrande just got forced into liquidation by a Hong Kong court just now. So that is how long this problem has been coming. And for all of the people that are upset that it's not come yet and it's taken so long, and believe you me, I am one of you, I will just tell you that this is how long economies that are created based on derivative financial values, where money can be created within the system without real asset value creation. You can just create money. That's the fiat system. That's the system that's based on nothing but the full faith and credit of the group that's printing the actual dollars. So this is not a surprise. So China's property market is collapsing. They have already lost to date $7 trillion of market capitalization from their stock market. The government has already come in and said, we are going to stimulate. And so we have that happening with China. Now we look at here at the UK. This is out today, February 15th. The UK falls into, and it's a very slight recession, but it is a recession. And this is going to add to the election that they're going through right now of their government. But you can see here, the UK GDP contracts 0.3% in Q2 of 2023, sealing a recession because they had a previous quarter of Q3 that was also a negative contraction. Economic output stands only at 1% higher than pre-COVID levels. The finance minister sees brighter days ahead. He's giving us a good, positive outlook, but the GDP per person shrinks. It's the longest run without growth on record. So now we see that the UK is in recession. All right, that's happening. Now, we also got reported yesterday, February 14th, that Japan, they're also in recession now, officially more of a recession in Japan. And the thing that happened with Japan's recession is that it sent them from the third largest economy in the world to the fourth largest economy in the world, with Germany moving into their spot at number 3. So you can see a slowdown in consumer and business spending has held in Japan at the end of last year, with the economy contracting for the second straight quarter. So we have Japan now officially in recession. You can see LA Times here. Japan slips into recession, loses its spot as the world's third largest economy, dated just today. And then let's go back from Japan, and let's go back to Europe again, and let's see what's happening with Germany. Now, Germany is a very unique situation. Germany is the manufacturing hub of Europe, and has been phenomenally successful at that manufacturing hub. With the Nord Stream 1 and 2, the Germans were getting very cheap energy from Russia and were very economically viable as a manufacturing base. However, when the Nord Streams shut down, blew up, whatever, that's a whole nother story. But when these pipelines were disrupted and Germany is no longer having a cheap energy source from Russia, they are realizing they are no longer economically viable. They cannot manufacture at an economically viable continuing basis. It's not profitable for them to be in manufacturing if they don't have a cheap energy source from Russia. So Germany is now in the process of deindustrializing. And that has impacted, because they are such a strong manufacturing hub, that has taken 3 of the 4 Eastern European countries, specifically Romania, Hungary, and Poland. That is dragging the Eastern European countries down because they are so also dependent on their trade with Germany. You can see Romania unexpectedly contracted, Hungary stagnated in a quarter. Eastern Europe is betting on consumer demand for recovery. So you've now got China situation happening. You've got Japan in recession. Japan is really a problem because they've had negative interest rates, very much like Germany, for extremely long time. They've had a decade of just deflationary, stagflation, no growth. It's been very, very difficult for Japan. And they were just on the cusp of raising interest rates. From negative, they were starting to get back to going towards raising rates, and they had to pull all of that because this recession got announced. So you got big problems with Japan. You have problems with the UK now in recession. They have an election. You have problems with Germany. We've seen all the distress of the global manufacturers' orders. We've seen global demand for oil going down. We've seen everything flashing globally, bad economic times ahead, except for one thing, and that's the US stock market. The US stock market believes that everything is going to magically work out great. So let's look at the United States and see where and what has happened in the United States this week. And you can see that we are finally starting to get, unlike the January jobs number, we are finally starting to get some really not great information here. US retail sales plummet in January, defying analyst expectations. And I love this phrase because I want to tell you something. There were 34 economists that were surveyed to get a consensus on what was going to happen with Japan for their, GDP for Q4. Some of them were at 0. Only one said that that GDP was going to contract and that they'd go into recession. 1 out of 34. So that's why you see these headlines that say Japan unexpectedly slips into recession. You guys, they economists have a vested interest and have a desire. I don't know why it shouldn't be this way, but it's very, very unusual to have an economy going into a second quarter of GDP contraction like Japan, while all of their economists, except for several that they thought GDP would be at 0 growth, and only one thought that GDP growth would be negative. Something is not going right with our economic forecasts. And this is why, you have all of these people calling for soft landing, soft global landing. And I have been like the lunatic, screaming like Chicken Little, the sky is falling. And I feel like people think that I'm the crazy one saying the sky is falling. But I am telling you that you cannot full math forever. You can try to fake a lot when you have a fiat system because it's not based on reality to start with. It's just based on full faith and credit. All right. And as long as you can keep consumer sentiment high and you can keep consumer spending high, then you can keep it going until the reckoning comes. And there is a reckoning. And so we have the first bad news of, besides, all of the economic data that is global, we have the first U.S. bad news outside of Germany. January's job market was so to the positive. So you can see here that we do have retail sales plummeting. Now, this is a huge plummet. We only expected to get a contraction. So in December, the month-over-month retail sales increase was 0.6%. So 0.6%, basically. So we had a growth from November to December, we had growth in retail sales. Now, from December to January, we expected a contraction. We expected a contraction of 0.1 to 0.2%, or 1/10 or 2/10%. We got a contraction of 0.8%. That is a huge discrepancy from consensus on the estimates. And that's why it's saying right here, define analyst expectation. This is a global problem. All of our analysts globally are putting out these propaganda, happy-go-lucky, smiley face economic forecasts, not based on reality. And then you've got the people that are reading the true data and saying, absolutely not. There is no soft landing. There is no Goldilocks just right scenario. It is not going to happen. We are headed into global recession, potentially global depression. But more importantly, this is the end of unipolarity. This is the beginning of multipolarity. And that brings a lot more economic challenges that come with it. One of which, what I just mentioned, is that you are going to now start to see for the first time pressure on the petrodollar, which basically states that crude has to be sold in US dollars. So we can see here also that we have Investopedia. January retail sales slump raises questions about the strength of the US consumer. And this is a report dated just today. So Powell this whole time has said, as long as people are employed, they will keep spending. As long as they keep spending, we are going to be okay, and we're going to have that soft landing. But we don't have the money to keep spending. The United States is going to print in treasuries $10 trillion worth of treasuries this year. 1.6 trillion of that is going to be for our deficit in 2024, which it will be bigger. But right now, that's the estimate. And 8.4 trillion of that $10 trillion is going to be printed this year is in refinancing. We have to refinance 8.4 trillion. Now, when that 8.4 trillion was written in the last 15 years, it was written at a 25 basis point Fed funds rate. We are now at a 5.25 Fed funds rate. So that is astronomically higher. The United States had the CBO director, Philip, and I can never pronounce his name correctly, Philip Swagel, testified before the House Budget Committee yesterday on February the 14th, Valentine's Day, and he stated that right now, our net interest in 2024 is going to exceed our non-defense discretionary spending, and that the trajectory of our deficit of 1.6 trillion in 2024 will be raised another $1 trillion and will be 2.6 trillion in 10 years. You have both Jerome Powell and Janet Yellen. Jerome Powell went on 60 Minutes in the last 2 weeks. Janet Yellen came out and did an interview yesterday, both of them stating that this fiscal path is not sustainable for the United States of America. We are spending as if it is like the end of the world. It's 1999 and 2000 is never going to come. Like, we are acting like we are on our last legs as the global currency, and we're going to just take it for all it's worth, write as much debt as we can, spend as much as we can. We are spending as much as we did during the coronavirus pandemic. Why? We're not supposedly in a war, even though we are with the UK, Ukraine, and Russia, and we're not in a pandemic. We're not stimulating. So why is our deficit so massive? We have a lot of problems. We have a lot of problems that are economically tied now to geopolitics and a lot of other types of politics. The CBO director, Philip, again, Swagel, yesterday during his testimony stated, and I want you to understand, the Biden administration has had 10 million illegal immigrants that have come through our borders since the Biden administration began, and Joe Biden basically signed an executive order to cancel Trump's Remain in Mexico executive order policy. So basically, the executive order policy that was fixing the border under Trump's administration, the Remain in Mexico policy, was rescinded by the executive order by Joe Biden when he came into the White House. And a lot of people cannot understand why this administration is consistently looking in the camera and saying there's no border crisis, yet all of us can see, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Detroit, communities across the country that are literally closing down public services, like closing down civic centers, closing down elementary schools, closing down community centers, because they have to now use those facilities for the illegal immigrants that have been brought to their city. We can all see that there is a crisis. We can all see that this administration is literally fighting with the state of Texas. We could have a constitutional crisis of the states versus the federal government that we haven't seen since the Civil War. Like, this is all truly massive stuff that is happening in the history of time and in our country, and we have to discuss it. But this this congressional budget office director, who basically is the chief accountant for the United States, that's what his role is. He's the chief guy that has to figure out how much everything is going to cost and how we're going to pay for it all and the tax revenue and all those things. So this chief accountant for the United States said yesterday to the House Budget Committee, in the next 10 years, higher net immigration is going to drive GDP growth 7 trillion higher, and increase government revenue by $1 trillion. So what this report that he was giving to Congress was insinuating, and not insinuating, stated, is our Social Security and Medicare system is about to be exploded, because the first generation that worked completely under those two systems, the baby boomers, is in the process of retiring. We only have 40% of our boomers currently retired. In just 5 years, by the end of 2028, that is going to be almost 99%. We have very few retirements in 2029, 2030. So you've got 5 years before you have the first full generation moved on to your social safety nets. And so the CBO knows that you're taking all those people out of the workforce and you're putting them onto a perpetual lifetime payment system and healthcare system, which are both astronomically, a lot, too much. It wasn't enough before coronavirus for us to be able to cover. Now, after coronavirus, this is a big problem. So he's talking about the aging of our population, the beginning of the robotization of jobs, so jobs and those things changing, and net immigration. He's pointing to as a financial solution, and I just think that deserves its own show by itself. How does the United States decide to solve their fiscal problem? By just allowing so much mass immigration into the country to get all these people into the system to get more tax revenue and more GDP growth. It's just unfathomable. But I want to go back and I want to just marry now. How does all of this economic information tie specifically to the geopolitical risks that we're seeing? And so if you watch the Tucker Carlson interview, and you will recognize that he talked to Putin about, de-dollarization and all of these things. Right after that interview, like literally the Wednesday this week, after the interview that came out last week, you started having these national security alerts that there was a national security threat that a member of the House, a Congress member, was bringing out to the public and asking the Biden administration to go ahead and declassify the information so that the American public could have it. So now the information that is being reported as the information that this congressman wants to declassify is Russia's nuclear capabilities in space. Now, I'm going to tie all this together because I know it's very disjointed. The bottom line is Tucker Carlson did an interview with Putin, and Putin talked about the de-dollarization of the world and the BRICS bloc because of the fact that the United States weaponized their dollar through this SWIFT system. Tucker Carlson subsequently has also recently done a long interview with Dennis Quaid. And I'm not a Tucker Carlson fan or not fan. I just have these two connections that he did these two interviews. Now, Dennis Quaid is a Hollywood actor, and he's been in like over 150 movies. He's one of the longest running careers in Hollywood, started when he was young. And, he's still in great shape, still making movies. And he's got this new project that Tucker interviewed him for. It's not a movie at all. And he said, look, I was really struck by this really big problem that we have that's got a 100% probability of coming true. And Tucker's like, what are you talking about? And he said, well, basically, this already has happened. I believe he quoted it as 1859. I'll have to double check the date. But apparently in the 1850s or 60s, some kind of solar flare pulse basically came to the earth and completely killed off, according to Dennis Quaid's interview with Tucker Carlson, killed off all of our telegraph system, completely killed off. And Dennis Quaid is describing how NASA has done the research, and NASA is saying that there is a 100% probability that there will be another solar flare. And now in modern time, that solar flare will in fact disrupt the electrical grid. And Dennis Quaid specifically, and I encourage you to go watch this interview. It's available on YouTube, Tucker Carlson, Dennis Quaid. Dennis Quaid then explained that this is the impact of a solar flare is that it will disintegrate. The gamma radiation basically disintegrates the electrical grid. Okay. Then he says that not only is there a 100% probability that the sun is going to give off a solar flare that would eventually do this to our electrical grid if we don't harden our electrical grid, but he also said that then you have rogue actors that also, and I just want you to understand where this is all leading to. Dennis Quaid has this interview with Tucker Carlson, who also had just interviewed Putin. And Dennis Quaid says you have the possibility of these rogue actors that have access to missiles that if they just bring them a certain height into the atmosphere and detonate them in the atmosphere, then that creates the equivalent of an EMP bomb, which is an electromagnetic pulse bomb. And specifically, Dennis Quaid referred to it as a super EMP bomb. And of course, a super EMP bomb because it is being detonated basically in space at an altitude that would affect the whole of the continental contiguous lower 48 of the United States. And it would completely disintegrate our electrical grid's capabilities. And we would be thrown back into the dark ages literally overnight. And Dennis Quaid quoted that the war games had been done on this scenario and that the war games found that within 1 year, 90% of our population would be dead. It's because everything we do relies now on electricity. We live in all over the entire United States because we either have air conditioning or heating. We have cars that are electric. We have electric stoves, electric refrigerators, electric washer and dryers. Everything we have is electric. Our phones, our computers, our televisions. We would have no communication, no internet, no access, no directions, no anything if something like this were to happen. And I just want you to understand, Tucker did the interview with Putin, and less than a week later, we have the House member coming out and saying there is a new national security threat that involves Russia. And then the administration is talking about, clarifying for us that what they're talking about is specifically Russia's ability to leverage nuclear weapons in space. And then you have Tucker Carlson in the same vicinity of time interviewing Dennis Quaid, the Hollywood actor, whose special project that he is working on is the 100% probability of solar flares basically creating a supernatural sonic EMP that would destroy our electrical grid. Or you have bad rogue actors that have access to missiles they can detonate at altitudes in space that would also be and would classify as a super EMP bomb. I happen to know a little bit about EMP bombs because in law school, I wrote my final paper on peak oil, EMP, and the electrical grid and how bad that was. And that was over 10 years ago. So we have problems that we didn't address in the last decade. And, Dennis Quaid made the point to Tucker Carlson that both China and Russia are much more advanced in the hardening of their electrical grids against EMP, whereas in America, it's stuck in, I don't know if it was Environmental Protection Committee or some kind of compliance committee, but it's stuck in committee, even though both Obama and Trump wrote executive orders about hardening of the electrical grids for this entire potential problem. So there is a situation that you guys need to understand where all this converges together, that as economic collapses happen, war is a solution for world leaders. They will abscond and they will obfuscate and they will hide and they will shelter themselves, or they'll think that they will, in a cloud of economic craziness by making the story shift to war. And so if we can shift to world war, if China can now attack Taiwan and get away with their probable massive economic situation, if Russia can do what, and I'm not ascribing to Russia any desire to do what anybody has said. No one is saying that Russia wants to detonate an EMP bomb. Don't hear that at all. But what I am saying is that you can see the United States has consistently put out information from NASA and from other government agencies about this big probability of the solar flare and its disruption of the electrical grid. You can also then see that they are also talking about a rogue nation's potential intentions to hurt the United States by using a missile at an altitude in space. So you can see that this idea has been planted through multiple sources into the forethought of Americans, so that if something like this happens, we don't say, oh my gosh, well, how did this happen? We have already heard this is probably going to happen. So what I tell you all this to tell you is that I think that we need to be prepared this year for things to really get a little bit really suspect and crazy. And I'm talking about water supplies and food supplies and just safety precautions, because I've never heard so much. And I actually even have a slide actually about this solar flare and NASA. I think I can pull it up right here if I can. Yeah, it's right here. Let me just repopulate and show you guys this slide I have. NASA warns of internet apocalypse that leaves people offline for months. This is the solar flare. This was an article from last year. So I have talked about this and talked about this and talked about this to the point I think that me and these people think I'm just reading crazy, stories written by weirdos. But it's no, this is what the groundwork has been laid. And because we keep getting a cyber attack alert, solar flare, EMP, electrical grid, alert, I would just take that to mean that the U.S. is potentially preparing for global conflict. And because we need to be able to feed our families and have water and resources in the eventuality, you have to understand people such as myself, and even the generation before me, most of us, Gen X and down, we have not seen global world war. It's really been it was the baby boomers and the greatest generation that were through World War I and World War II. And Gen X, we've had, relatively, we kind of came out, on the other side of Vietnam. We've had, Iraq, Afghanistan. We haven't had these global conflicts. So we have not lived through, what does that look like? What does that do to your grocery store? What does that do to your gasoline prices? We don't know. We haven't lived through America being attacked. We haven't lived through America being directly at war, in this hemisphere, in our own theater. So it's all been remote in some other Asian country, somewhere, Middle East, far away, and it hasn't been. So we don't know what war is like. And because we don't, and because it seems like through the news channels and the mechanisms they get information and expectations out to the US population, that they expect that we are going to have some kind of electrical grid disruption, and escalation to war. And I think escalation to war does make sense in the United States in 2024, because we have an election, and we definitely need, this administration needs, and this global government that is both the right and the left. This is all a uniparty globally. It truly is. And they need the obfuscation of war to hide the fact that the economy really is and a really big problem, because the world is de-dollarizing and moving to the east. And so China might just see this as their perfect opportunity to go and take Taiwan back and unify, as they have said. They will have a unified China. And so China is looking at that possibility. We don't know what Russia's looking at, but we do know that NATO is looking at, potentially just getting done with this Ukraine situation in an escalatory way. So we will see what happens. But I bring all of those economic factors, all of those geopolitical factors, and even some of the science factors of science and the sun. And don't forget, we have the second half, the first part, I think, crisscrossed in 17. We have the second half 7 years later happening the first week, or I believe it's April the 8th of this year, 2024. It's going to cross on the other direction and put an X right over the United States from the 2017 crossing to the 2024 crossing this 7 years later. So we have a lot of strange events happening in 2024. And I am telling you all these things so that you cannot be scared, but you can prepare and just understand that they're coming, so that you're not going to be in fear when it comes. You know, you have to have faith in the higher purpose for your life and what is ultimately the reason that you're here. So for that, I will wrap for this Crashes and Taxes. I appreciate you guys. I share this, like this, and get it to your friends and family if you have a concern about all of these global things that are happening, convergence of all things in 2024. That is where we are, and I hope that you do care enough to share that message. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.